The rope burned against Amy Meyer's neck as she stumbled through the mountain pass, her bound hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from the certainty that death followed close behind. The noose hung loose around her throat, a grim reminder of the justice that awaited her in Millbrook, where Judge Stephen Cook had already prepared the gallows. Each step forward through the rocky terrain felt like borrowed time, stolen moments before the inevitable tightening of hemp around her windpipe. The mountain air cut through her thin dress like winter knives, and Amy could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue during the rough wagon ride up the treacherous path. Behind her, the voices of her captors grew distant, lost in an argument about whether to make camp or push through the night. She did not wait to hear their decision. Her bare feet found purchase on the loose stones, and she ran. Pine branches whipped across her face as she crashed through the underbrush, the rope around her neck catching on low-hanging limbs and jerking her backward with violent force. Stars exploded behind her eyelids, but she pressed forward, driven by a desperation that transcended rational thought. The accusations echoed in her mind like thunder rolling through the valley below. Witch, murderer, devil woman. The words had sealed her fate long before any evidence could be presented, long before truth could find its voice in that makeshift courtroom. Her lungs burned as the altitude stole her breath, but Amy continued climbing, following what appeared to be an old deer trail carved into the mountainside. The moon provided scant light through the canopy of evergreens, casting shadows that danced and shifted like the accusations that had brought her to this desperate flight. Every snap of a twig beneath her feet sounded like thunder in the stillness, every rustle of leaves like the whispered condemnations of the townspeople who had gathered to watch her burn. The trial had been a mockery from the moment Brian Bennett dragged her into the courthouse, his meaty hands leaving bruises on her arms that still throbbed with each heartbeat. The charges were as substantial as morning mist, built on the fevered imaginings of Tyler Cruz, who swore he had seen her dancing naked under the full moon, calling down curses upon his livestock. When his prize bull had died of a wasting sickness 3 days later, the connection was sealed in the minds of the God-fearing citizens of Millbrook. Amy had tried to speak in her own defense, to explain that she was merely an herbalist who helped the local women with their monthly troubles and difficult births. But Kevin Alvarez, the town doctor, had stood before the court and declared her remedies to be the devil handiwork, her knowledge of healing plants proof of her congress with dark forces. The fact that she lived alone in a cabin at the edge of town, that she had never married despite her 26 years, that she read books and spoke her mind freely, all of this painted her as an outsider deserving of suspicion. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The memory of Elizabeth Allen weeping on the witness stand still haunted Amy as she climbed higher into the mountains. Elizabeth had been her friend once, had come to her in secret when her husband grew violent, seeking salves for the bruises that decorated her pale skin like purple flowers. But when the accusations began to fly, Elizabeth had turned against her, claiming that Amy had given her potions to make her husband love her more, potions that had instead driven him to greater violence. The betrayal cut deeper than any rope burn. Maria Young had been the final nail in Amy's coffin, testifying that she had seen strange lights emanating from Amy's cabin in the dead of night, had heard chanting in a language that sounded like the tongues of demons. The fact that Amy often stayed up late reading by candlelight, that she sometimes sang old songs her grandmother had taught her, songs in the Irish tongue that her family had brought across the ocean, meant nothing to ears already poisoned by fear and superstition. The verdict had been swift and unanimous. Death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on the following day. But as Amy sat in her cell that night, listening to the sound of hammers building her gallows, she had made peace with her fate. She had lived her life according to her own conscience, had helped more people than she had harmed, and if that was worth dying for in the eyes of Millbrook, then so be it. It was Samantha King who had changed everything. The young woman had appeared at Amy's cell window just after midnight, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking as she worked to pry loose the iron bars. Samantha was barely 18, married to a man 3 times her age who treated her more like property than a wife. She had come to Amy months earlier, desperate for something to prevent another pregnancy that her frail body could not survive. Amy had helped her, as she had helped so many others, and now Samantha was returning the favor. The escape had been easier than it should have been. The guards were drunk on corn whiskey, celebrating their successful capture of the town witch, and they had not bothered to check on their prisoner until morning. By then, Amy was already miles away, following the mountain trails that Samantha had described, heading toward a place where the law of Millbrook could not reach her. But freedom had proven to be an illusion. Sandra Cooper, the sheriff wife, had spotted Amy fleeing through the early morning mist and had raised the alarm. Within hours, a posse was formed, led by Judge Cook himself, who seemed to take Amy's escape as a personal affront to his authority. They had tracked her through the foothills with the determination of men who believed they were doing God work, and they had found her just as the sun reached its peak in the cloudless sky. The recapture had been brutal and swift. They had thrown the noose around her neck immediately, more as a symbol of their intent than as a practical restraint, and had bound her hands with rope that cut into her wrists until they bled. Judge Cook had informed her that they would make camp for the night and continue to the hanging tree at first light, where her execution would proceed as planned, witnessed by Riad and the mountain wilderness, if not by the citizens of Millbrook. But Amy had not survived 26 years in a world that seemed determined to crush women like her by accepting defeat easily. When the opportunity presented itself, when her captors grew careless in their confidence, she had taken it without hesitation. Now she climbed higher into the mountains, driven by an instinct for survival that burned brighter than the rope burns on her throat. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as Amy pushed deeper into the wilderness. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, sending small avalanches cascading down the mountainside, and more than once she found herself clinging to scrubby pine branches to keep from falling into the dark ravines that yawned on either side of the narrow path. The noose around her neck had caught on so many branches that the rope was beginning to fray, but it still held tight enough to remind her with every breath of how close death remained. Her dress, already torn from her flight through the underbrush, caught on a sharp outcropping of granite and ripped further, leaving her legs exposed to the mountain cold. The thin fabric provided little protection against the elements, and Amy could feel her strength beginning to ebb as hypothermia crept into her bones like a slow poison. Her lips had turned blue, and her fingers were so numb that she could barely feel the rope that bound her wrist. Behind her, the voices of her pursuers had grown closer again. They had discovered her escape more quickly than she had hoped, and now they followed her trail with the relentless determination of bloodhounds. Judge Cook's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, shouting orders to his men, promising a reward to whoever brought her back alive so that justice could be properly served. The word justice fell from his lips like a curse, heavy with the weight of his own righteousness. Amy knew that she could not outrun them much longer. Her body was failing, her strength sapped by cold and fear, and the brutal treatment she had endured. But something deep inside her refused to surrender, some core of defiance that had kept her alive through years of suspicion and persecution. She would die on her own terms if she had to die at all, not dancing at the end of Judge Cook's rope while he quoted scripture and called it righteousness. The trail ahead split into two paths, one leading higher into the peaks where the snow never melted, the other descending toward what looked like a valley shrouded in mist. Amy hesitated for only a moment before choosing the upward path, reasoning that if she was going to die, it might as well be among the clouds where the angels could find her more easily. The thought brought a bitter smile to her cracked lips, the first smile she had managed since this nightmare began. As she climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the cold more brutal. Amy's breathing came in short, painful gasps, and she could see her breath forming clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain air. The rope around her neck seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the weight of her fate was literally dragging her down toward the earth. Her bound hands made it nearly impossible to maintain her balance on the increasingly treacherous terrain, and she fell more than once, scraping her knees and palms on the sharp rocks. The moon had set, leaving only the stars to light her way, and Amy found herself stumbling more frequently as shadows played tricks with her vision. She could hear the sound of water somewhere ahead, a stream or waterfall that spoke of life in this barren landscape, and she pushed toward it with the last reserves of her strength. Water meant the possibility of survival, meant that she might live long enough to see another sunrise, even if it was her last. The sound grew louder as she climbed, and soon Amy could smell the moisture in the air. could feel the slight increase in humidity that spoke of rushing water nearby. She rounded a bend in the trail and found herself standing on the edge of a small clearing where a stream tumbled down from the heights above, forming a series of pools that reflected the starlight like scattered diamonds. The sight was so beautiful that it took her breath away, and for a moment she forgot her desperate circumstances and simply stood in wonder. It was then that she saw the cabin. The structure was small and rough-hewn, built from logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color that made it almost invisible against the backdrop of granite and pine. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin column that dispersed quickly in the mountain wind, and warm yellow light spilled from its single window like a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Amy stared at it for a long moment, hardly daring to believe that she had found shelter in this desolate place. But with hope came fear. Whoever lived in this remote cabin might be as quick to judge her as the people of Millbrook had been. The noose around her neck and the rope binding her hands would tell their own story, and that story might seal her fate as surely as any testimony from Tyler Cruz or Maria Young. Still, she had little choice. The cold was killing her slowly, and her pursuers would find her soon enough if she remained in the open. Amy approached the cabin with careful steps, her bare feet silent on the pine needles that carpeted the clearing. Through the window, she could see the flickering light of a fire and the shadow of a man moving about inside. He appeared to be alone, which was both a blessing and a curse. A single man might be easier to convince of her innocence, but he might also be more likely to see her as a threat to be eliminated rather than a person in need of help. She crept closer to the window and peered inside, trying to get a better look at the cabin occupant. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that spoke of months spent away from civilization. His clothes were simple but well-made, the kind of practical garments that a man wore when he lived by his own labor rather than the labor of others. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own space, someone who had found peace in solitude. As Amy watched, the man turned toward the window, and she caught a glimpse of his face in the firelight. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, but not hardened by cruelty. His eyes were dark and thoughtful, the eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand its complexities. There was something in his expression that gave Amy hope, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. But before she could decide whether to reveal herself, her body made the decision for her. The cold and exhaustion finally overcame her remaining strength, and she collapsed against the cabin wall with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the clearing like thunder. Through the window, she saw the man's head snap up, his body tensing as he listened for the source of the sound. Amy tried to push herself back to her feet, tried to flee before he could discover her, but her legs would no longer support her weight. She slumped against the rough logs of the cabin wall, feeling the bark scrape against her exposed skin, and waited for whatever fate awaited her. At least it would be warmer than freezing to death in the mountains, she thought with dark humor. At least it would be quicker than slowly starving in the wilderness. The cabin door opened with a creak of hinges that needed oil, and the man stepped out into the clearing. He held a rifle in his hands, not pointed at her but ready to be raised if necessary. In the starlight, he looked even larger than he had through the window, a giant of a man who could probably snap her neck with his bare hands if he chose to. But his movements were careful and controlled, the movements of someone who understood the value of restraint. He spotted her immediately, his dark eyes taking in her disheveled appearance, the noose around her neck, the rope binding her hands. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke, and Amy found herself holding her breath as she waited for his reaction. Would he see a dangerous criminal who deserved whatever fate had brought her to his doorstep? Would he see a woman in need of help, regardless of whatever crime she might have committed? Or would he see something else entirely, something that she herself did not yet understand? When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who spent more time talking to mountains than to people. But there was no anger in it, no fear or disgust, just a quiet curiosity that gave Amy the first real hope she had felt since this nightmare began. "You look like you could use some help," he said, setting his rifle aside and taking a step closer. "The noose around your neck tells a story, but I have a feeling it is not the whole story." Amy tried to speak, tried to explain her circumstances, but her voice came out as little more than a whisper, cracked and broken from cold and fear. She managed only a few words before her voice failed entirely, but those words seemed to be enough. "I am not what they say I am," she whispered. "I am not a witch." The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected as much. He approached her with the same careful movements he had used when first emerging from the cabin, and Amy could see now that his caution was not born of suspicion, but of a desire not to frighten her further. When he was close enough to touch her, he knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers, and Amy saw something in his expression that she had not seen in weeks. Compassion. "My name is Zachary Hall," he said quietly, "and I think the first thing we need to do is get that rope off your neck." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a knife, its blade gleaming in the starlight. Amy flinched instinctively, but Zachary made no sudden movements, instead showing her the knife and explaining what he intended to do. "I am going to cut the noose first," he said. "It will not hurt, but you might feel some relief once the pressure is gone." Amy nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. She tilted her head back, exposing her throat to this stranger who could kill her as easily as save her, and felt the cold touch of steel against her skin. Zachary worked with practiced precision, sliding the blade between the rope and her neck, careful not to cut her flesh as he severed the hemp fibers one by one. When the noose finally fell away, Amy gasped as if she had been drowning and had suddenly found air. The relief was so intense that tears sprang to her eyes, tears that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air and everything to do with the simple human kindness that this stranger had shown her. She had forgotten that such kindness existed, forgotten that there were people in the world who would help a stranger without first demanding to know their crimes. Zachary set the severed noose aside and turned his attention to the ropes binding her hands. These were tied more tightly, and it took him several minutes to work the blade between the coils without cutting her skin. As he worked, he spoke to her in low, soothing tones, the way a man might speak to a frightened animal that he was trying to help. "You are safe now," he said. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you are running from, you are safe in this place. No one will hurt you while you are under my protection." The words were so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything Amy had experienced in recent weeks, that she began to cry in earnest. Great sobs racked her body as months of fear and desperation finally found release, and she wept for everything she had lost, for the life that had been torn away from her by fear and superstition, for the friends who had turned against her when she needed them most. Zachary did not try to stop her tears or tell her that everything would be all right. Instead, he simply continued working on the ropes, his strong hands gentle as he freed her wrists from their bonds. When the last rope fell away, Amy flexed her fingers, feeling the blood flow back into her hands like fire running through her veins. The sensation was painful but welcome, proof that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. "There," Zachary said, sitting back on his heels. "That is better. Now let us get you inside where it is warm. You look like you have been through enough for one night." He stood and offered her his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Amy took it. His palm was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with his hands for a living, but his grip was gentle as he helped her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, weakened by cold and exhaustion, and she might have fallen if not for his support. Zachary guided her toward the cabin, one arm around her waist to keep her upright, and Amy found herself leaning against his solid warmth gratefully. She could smell wood smoke and pine sap on his clothes, clean scents that spoke of honest labor and simple living. It had been so long since she had been close to another human being without fear that the contact was almost overwhelming. The interior of the cabin was small but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture that showed the same careful craftsmanship as the building itself. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and the air was warm and dry, a welcome relief from the bitter cold outside. Zachary led her to a chair near the fire and gently helped her sit down, then moved to add more wood to the flames. "You need food and warmth," he said, his back to her as he tended the fire, "and probably some medical attention for those rope burns. But first, you need to tell me if there is anyone following you. If there is danger coming to this place, I need to know about it." Amy's voice was stronger now, warmed by the fire and strengthened by the simple act of being treated like a human being rather than a dangerous animal. "There are men from Millbrook," she said. A judge named Stephen Cook and his posse. They were taking me to be hanged for witchcraft, but I escaped. They are following my trail, and they will not give up easily. Zachary turned to face her, his expression serious but not fearful. How far behind you are they? Not far, Amy admitted. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They have horses and they know these mountains better than I do. If you help me, you will be putting yourself in danger. They will see you as an accomplice to my escape. Zachary was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and determined, the voice of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed from it. Then we had better make sure they do not find you, he said. This cabin has a root cellar that is well hidden. You can hide there while I deal with your pursuers. Amy stared at him in amazement. You would do that for me. You do not even know me. You do not know what I am accused of or whether the accusations are true. Zachary met her eyes steadily, and Amy saw something in his gaze that took her breath away. It was not just compassion or kindness, though both were there. It was recognition, the recognition of one outsider for another. One person who had been judged and found wanting by society for another who had suffered the same fate. I know enough, Zachary said simply. I know that no woman deserves to die for the crime of being different, for the crime of living outside the narrow boundaries that men like Judge Cook draw around acceptable behavior. I know that you came here alone and afraid, with a noose around your neck, and that tells me everything I need to know about the justice you can expect from the men who are chasing you. He moved to a corner of the cabin and began pulling aside a heavy rug that covered a section of the floor. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor, cunningly concealed and fitted so perfectly that it was nearly invisible when closed. Amy watched in amazement as he lifted the door to reveal a small but comfortable space below, lined with shelves that held preserved food and other supplies. I built this when I first came to the mountains, Zachary explained. A man who chooses to live alone needs to be prepared for unexpected visitors, whether they come in peace or with hostile intent. You will be safe down there, and there is enough food and water to last for days if necessary. Amy looked at the hidden cellar, then back at Zachary's face, trying to understand why this stranger was willing to risk so much for someone he had just met. The answer was there in his eyes, in the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from the fire. He had been where she was now, had faced the judgment of people who could not understand or accept what he was, and he had chosen exile over compromise. Who are you? She asked quietly. What brought you to this place? Zachary smiled for the first time since she had arrived, a sad smile that spoke of old pain and hard-won wisdom. I am a man who learned that sometimes the only way to be free is to walk away from the world that wants to cage you, he said. I am a man who found peace in these mountains, and I will not let anyone take that peace away from me or from anyone else who seeks it. The sound of voices in the distance cut through the night air like a blade, and both Amy and Zachary froze as they listened. The voices were still far away, but they were definitely getting closer, and Amy could make out the distinctive tone of Judge Cook shouting orders to his men. Her heart began to race as the reality of her situation crashed back over her like a wave. They found my trail, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. They are coming. Zachary was already moving, his actions calm and efficient despite the urgency of the situation. He helped Amy down into the root cellar, his strong hands supporting her as she descended the rough wooden ladder that led to the hidden space below. The cellar was larger than it had appeared from above, with enough room for her to sit or lie down comfortably, and the air was cool but not cold. Stay quiet no matter what you hear, Zachary told her as he handed down a blanket and a jar of water. Do not come out until I tell you it is safe. If something happens to me, wait until morning and then head higher into the mountains. There is a trail that leads to a trading post about 2 days' walk from here. The man who runs it is a friend of mine, and he will help you. Amy wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that she could not let him risk his life for her, but the sound of approaching horses cut off her words. Zachary gave her one last look, his dark eyes serious but unafraid, and then he lowered the trapdoor above her head. Amy heard the scrape of furniture being moved as he concealed the entrance, and then there was only silence and in the sound of her own rapid breathing in the darkness below. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and tried to calm her racing heart as she listened to the sounds from above. She could hear Zachary moving around the cabin, and she wondered what he was doing to prepare for the arrival of her pursuers. Was he hiding evidence of her presence? Was he preparing to fight? Or was he simply going about his normal evening routine, acting as if nothing unusual had happened? The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon Amy could hear the snorting of horses and the jingle of harness as the posse arrived at the cabin. She pressed her ear to the wooden floor above her head, straining to hear what was being said, her heart pounding so loudly that she was afraid it might give her away. Judge Cook's voice was the first she recognized, loud and authoritative as he called out to Zachary. "You there in the cabin? Come out where we can see you. We are officers of the law, and we have business with you." Amy held her breath as she waited for Zachary's response, wondering if this was the moment when her brief taste of freedom would come to an end. But when Zachary's voice came through the cabin walls, it was calm and steady, showing no sign of the fear or guilt that Judge Cook was no doubt expecting to hear. "I am coming out," Zachary called back. "Keep your weapons lowered. I am not armed, and I mean you no harm." Amy heard the cabin door open and the sound of Zachary's boots on the wooden porch. Through the floorboards, she could hear the creak of leather as the mounted men shifted in their saddles, and she could imagine them surrounding the cabin like wolves circling their prey. Her hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to climb out of her hiding place and face whatever fate awaited her, rather than cowering in the darkness, while Zachary risked his life for her. "Good evening," Zachary said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Judge Cook dismounted from his horse with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to commanding respect through his presence alone. In the flickering light from the cabin windows, his face appeared carved from granite, all hard angles and stern disapproval. His dark coat billowed around him as he approached the porch, and Amy could hear the creak of his leather boots on the wooden steps. "We are tracking a dangerous fugitive," Cook said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "A woman named Amy Myers, convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to hang. She escaped from our custody this afternoon, and her trail leads directly to this place. Have you seen her?" From her hiding place beneath the floorboards, Amy pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle any sound that might escape. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently that she was certain everyone above could hear it. The darkness of the root cellar seemed to press in around her like a living thing, and she fought against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thought. Zachary's response came after a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. "I have been alone here all evening," he said. "I have not seen any woman, fugitive or otherwise." "These mountains are vast, Judge Cook. If someone is trying to hide in them, they could be anywhere." The sound of more boots on the porch told Amy that other members of the posse had dismounted and were joining their leader. She recognized Brian Bennett's heavy tread and could imagine his thick fingers resting on the handle of his pistol, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. The man had always been quick to violence, using his size and strength to intimidate anyone who dared to question his authority. "You mind if we take a look around?" Bennett said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled aggression. "Just to be thorough, you understand. Woman like that, she might be hiding somewhere you have not thought to look." Amy heard Zachary shift his weight on the porch boards above her head, and she could sense the tension that had entered his posture even though she could not see him. The pause before his response was shorter this time, but it carried a weight that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "I am afraid I do mind," Zachary said, and there was something in his tone that had not been there before, a hardness that spoke of lines that should not be crossed. "This is my home, and I have given you my word that I have seen no fugitive. That should be sufficient for men who claim to serve justice." Judge Cook's voice, when it came, was cold as winter wind. "Your word might carry more weight if we knew who you were giving it. You have a name, stranger. You have a reason for living alone in these mountains like some kind of hermit." Amy could hear the challenge in the judge's tone, the implication that any man who chose solitude over society must have something to hide. It was the same suspicion that had followed her throughout her life. The assumption that anyone who lived outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior must be guilty of some crime, some moral failing that justified whatever punishment society chose to inflict. "My name is Zachary Hall, and I live here because I choose to live here." I harm no one and ask nothing from anyone. That is all you need to know about me." The silence that followed was thick with tension, and Amy could imagine the standoff taking place above her head. Judge Cook and his men, armed and confident in their authority, facing a single man who refused to be intimidated by their badges and their righteousness. She knew that Zachary was taking an enormous risk by defying them, that men like Cook did not tolerate challenges to their authority lightly. Tyler Crew's voice broke the silence, high and nervous as always when he found himself in the presence of conflict. "Maybe she went around the cabin, Judge. Maybe she is hiding in the woods nearby. We should spread out and search the area." "That is exactly what we are going to do," Cook replied, but his attention remained focused on Zachary. "Mr. Hall, I suggest you reconsider your position. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, and I would hate to see you face charges for protecting someone who consorts with the devil." Amy felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold air in the root cellar. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Judge Cook was not just looking for her, he was looking for any excuse to expand his authority, to demonstrate his power over anyone who dared to question him. Zachary had made himself a target simply by refusing to bow to the judge's demands. "I am not harboring anyone," Zachary said, his voice steady despite the danger he faced. "And I would suggest that you be very careful about making accusations without evidence. These mountains have a way of humbling men who think too highly of their own importance." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Amy heard one of the men above shift nervously at the implied warning. Zachary might be outnumbered, but he had the advantage of knowing the terrain, of understanding how quickly the mountains could turn deadly for men who underestimated their power. It was a reminder that civilization authority meant little in a place where nature still held sway. Brian Bennett's voice cut through the tension like a blade drawn from its sheath. "You threatening us, mountain man? Because if you are, we can settle this right here and now." Amy heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being drawn from its holster, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. The situation was escalating beyond words, beyond threats, into the realm of violence where men died for the crime of standing their ground. She wanted to burst from her hiding place, to surrender herself rather than watch Zachary die for her sake, but she forced herself to remain still. Moving now would only guarantee that both of them would die. Zachary's response was calm, almost conversational, but Amy could hear the steel beneath his words. "I am not threatening anyone, Mr. Bennett. I am simply pointing out that these mountains can be dangerous for men who are not prepared for them, especially men who let their emotions cloud their judgment." The sound of more guns being drawn filled the night air, and Amy realized that the confrontation had reached a tipping point from which there might be no return. Judge Cook had brought armed men with him, men who were accustomed to using violence to solve their problems, and they would not hesitate to kill Zachary if they believed he was standing between them and their quarry. But then another voice joined the conversation, one that Amy had not expected to hear. Kevin Alvarez, the town doctor, spoke with the nervous authority of a man who was more comfortable with books than with guns, but who understood the gravity of the situation unfolding before him. "Judge Cook, perhaps we should consider that Mr. Hall might be telling the truth. The woman could have passed by this place without stopping. These mountains are vast," as he said, "and she could be miles away by now." Amy felt a flicker of hope at the doctor's words, but it was quickly extinguished by Judge Cook's response. His voice carried the finality of a man who had already made up his mind and would not be swayed by reason or caution. "Dr. Alvarez, I appreciate your concern, but I did not ask for your medical opinion. The woman trail leads here, and that is all I need to know. Mr. Hall, you have one final opportunity to cooperate. Allow us to search your property, or we will assume that you are complicit in her escape." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and choking. Amy knew that Zachary had no good choices left. If he continued to refuse, the men above would likely kill him and search the cabin anyway. If he agreed to let them search, they would find her hidden cellar, and both of them would die. She closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. But Zachary's response surprised everyone, including Amy herself. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation that seemed to signal his surrender to the inevitable. "Very well, Judge Cook, you may search the cabin, but I want it understood that you do so against my will and over my objections. I will not be held responsible for any damage you cause or any consequences that result from your actions. Amy heard footsteps moving across the porch as the men prepared to enter the cabin, and she pressed herself deeper into the corner of the root cellar, trying to make herself as small as possible. The blanket Zachary had given her was dark-colored, and she pulled it over her head, hoping that even if they discovered the hidden entrance, she might remain invisible in the shadows below. The cabin door opened with its familiar creak, and Amy could hear the heavy footsteps of multiple men moving around the small space above her head. They were not being gentle in their search, and she could hear furniture being moved, drawers being pulled open, and personal belongings being scattered across the floor. The violation of Zachary's private space made her stomach turn with anger and shame. Judge Cook's voice echoed through the cabin as he directed his men's search. Check every corner, every hiding place. Look for signs that she has been here. Clothing, food, anything that might indicate her presence. Amy heard Tyler Cruz's nervous voice as he poked through Zachary's belongings. There is not much here, Judge, just the basics. This fellow lives pretty simply. Too simply, Brian Bennett added with suspicion. What kind of man lives like this, with nothing but the bare necessities? Makes you wonder what he is hiding. The search continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Amy could hear them moving around the cabin, opening cabinets, looking under the bed, checking every possible hiding place, except the one where she actually lay concealed. The root cellar entrance was so well hidden that even men actively searching for it might miss it, especially in the dim light of the cabin interior. But then she heard a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was the scrape of the heavy rug being moved aside, the same rug that concealed the trap door to her hiding place. Someone had found the entrance to the root cellar, and her brief reprieve from death was about to come to an end. Well, well, what do we have here? Bennett said, his voice thick with satisfaction. Looks like our mountain man has been keeping secrets after all. Amy heard the creak of hinges as the trapdoor was lifted, and suddenly light flooded down into her hiding place. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to make herself invisible, but she knew it was hopeless. They had found her, and now both she and Zachary would pay the price for his attempt to protect her. But the voice that called down into the cellar was not what she expected. It was Kevin Alvarez, and he sounded genuinely puzzled rather than triumphant. It is just a root cellar, Judge. Storage for food and supplies. I do not see anything unusual down here. Amy opened her eyes cautiously and realized that the light coming down into the cellar was not from a lantern held directly above the opening. Instead, it was the indirect glow from the cabin fireplace, filtered through the trapdoor opening. She was pressed into the far corner of the cellar, wrapped in the dark blanket, and from above she would be nearly invisible unless someone climbed down with a light to search thoroughly. Judge Cook's voice carried his frustration and growing anger. Look more carefully, Doctor. The woman has to be here somewhere. Her trail ends at this cabin. Amy held her breath as she heard footsteps on the ladder leading down into the cellar. Someone was coming down to search more thoroughly, and this time there would be no escape. She pressed herself against the wall and tried to become one with the shadows, but she knew it was only a matter of seconds before she was discovered. The footsteps reached the bottom of the ladder, and Amy could see the dim outline of a man moving around the cellar with a small lantern in his hand. But instead of the rough voice of Brian Bennett or the authoritative tone of Judge Cook, she heard Kevin Alvarez speaking quietly, almost to himself. Just preserve food and basic supplies, the doctor said, his voice carrying clearly to the men above. Some root vegetables, dried meat, the usual things a man would store for winter. Nothing out of the ordinary. Amy realized that Alvarez was standing less than 3 feet from her hiding place, close enough to touch her if he reached out his hand. The lantern light should have revealed her presence immediately, but somehow the doctor seemed to be looking everywhere except directly at her. She wondered if her eyes were playing tricks on her, if fear and desperation were causing her to imagine that she remained hidden when she was actually in plain sight. But then Alvarez did something that made her heart stop beating altogether. He turned towards her corner of the cellar, raised his lantern higher, and looked directly at her hiding place. For a moment that seemed to last forever, their eyes met across the small space, and Amy saw her own death reflected in his gaze. But instead of calling out to alert the others, Alvarez simply nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and turned away. When he spoke, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact, showing no sign of the momentous decision he had just made. "Nothing down here but what you would expect to find," he called up to the men above. "Whoever you are looking for, she is not in this cellar." Amy could hardly believe what she had just witnessed. Kevin Alvarez, the same man who had testified against her at her trial, who had declared her remedies to be the devil handiwork, had just looked her in the eye and chosen to protect her. The betrayal she had expected had not come, and instead she had found an ally in the most unlikely place. The doctor climbed back up the ladder, and Amy heard the trap door being lowered back into place. The scrape of furniture being moved told her that someone was concealing the entrance again, and then there was only the sound of continued searching above her head. But the tone of the search had changed, becoming more perfunctory, more resigned to failure. Judge Cook's voice carried his growing frustration as the search continued to yield nothing. "She has to be here somewhere. The trail does not lie." "Maybe the trail is older than we thought," Tyler Cruz suggested nervously. "Maybe she passed through here earlier and kept moving. These mountain winds can play tricks with tracks." "Or maybe your tracking skills are not as good as you think they are," Zachary said, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. "I told you I had not seen any fugitive, and your search has confirmed that. Perhaps it is time for you to continue your hunt elsewhere." The suggestion was reasonable, but Amy could hear the anger in Judge Cook's voice as he responded. His authority had been challenged, his certainty questioned, and he was not the kind of man who accepted such challenges gracefully. "Do not presume to tell me my business, Mr. Hall. I know what I saw, and I know what the evidence tells me. That woman was here, even if she is not here now." The accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark with the promise of violence to come. Amy could sense that Judge Cook was not ready to admit defeat, that his pride would not allow him to simply walk away empty-handed. He had brought his men this far based on his certainty that she was here, and to leave without her would be an admission that he had been wrong. Brian Bennett's voice cut through the tension with its usual bluntness. "Maybe we should burn the place down, Judge. If she was here, fire will flush her out. If she was not, well, at least we send a message about what happens to people who do not cooperate with the law." The casual suggestion of arson and murder made Amy's stomach turn with revulsion. These men, who claimed to serve justice and righteousness, were willing to commit any crime to satisfy their own sense of authority. They would burn an innocent man cabin simply to demonstrate their power, and they would call it justice while they did it. Zachary's response was immediate and uncompromising. "You burn my home, Mr. Bennett, and you will answer for it. I may be outnumbered, but I am not defenseless, and I know these mountains better than any of you. Touch one board of my cabin, and I will make you regret it for whatever time you have left to draw breath." The threat was delivered in the same calm tone Zachary had used throughout the confrontation, but there was something in his voice that made even Brian Bennett pause. This was not the bluster of a frightened man trying to sound brave. This was the quiet promise of someone who had the means and the will to carry out his threats. Someone who understood violence and was not afraid to use it when necessary. Judge Cook seemed to sense the shift in the dynamic, the recognition that they had pushed Zachary as far as he was willing to be pushed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of tactical retreat, though his anger remained barely controlled beneath the surface. "We will not burn anything tonight," he said. "But this matter is not finished, Mr. Hall. I will be watching you, and if I discover that you have lied to me, if I find any evidence that you helped that witch escape, I will see you hang beside her." The promise of future retribution was clear, but Amy could hear in the judge's voice that he was preparing to withdraw for now. The search had failed to produce the results he had expected, and continuing to press the confrontation that risked escalating it beyond his ability to control. Better to retreat now and return another time with a better plan. "Pack it up," Cook ordered his men. "We will continue the search at first light. Spread out and check the other cabins and camps in the area. She cannot have gone far on foot." Amy heard the sound of men moving around the cabin, gathering their equipment and preparing to leave. But she also heard something else, a whispered conversation between two of the searchers that made her blood run cold. "She was here," Tyler Cruz was saying to someone, his voice barely audible through the floorboards. "I can smell her scent in the air, that herb smell she always carried. She was definitely here." Kevin Alvarez's response was equally quiet but firm. You are imagining things, Tyler. Fear and exhaustion can play tricks on a man's senses. There is nothing here but an honest man trying to live his life in peace. The exchange told Amy that her presence had not gone completely unnoticed, that at least one member of the posse suspected she had been in the cabin despite the failed search. Tyler Cruz had always been more observant than his nervous demeanor suggested, and his ability to detect her lingering scent meant that her secret might not remain safe for long. But Kevin Alvarez continued to deflect suspicion, using his authority as a doctor and an educated man to override Tyler's concerns. The fact that he was actively working to protect her still amazed Amy, and she wondered what had changed his mind about her guilt. Perhaps seeing her with a noose around her neck had reminded him that she was a human being rather than a monster. Or perhaps he had simply had time to reconsider the evidence that had seemed so convincing during her trial. The sound of horses being mounted and equipment being secured told Amy that the posse was finally preparing to leave. But Judge Cook's voice carried one final warning, delivered with the authority of a man who was accustomed to having the last word in any confrontation. Remember what I told you, Mr. Hall. I will be watching and I will be back. If that woman surfaces anywhere in these mountains, if any evidence comes to light that you helped her, you will face the full weight of the law. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Zachary's response was equally final, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down authority before and survived. You do what you feel you must do, Judge Cook. But remember that these mountains have their own justice, older and more permanent than anything you might dispense from your courtroom. Men who come here with violence in their hearts often find more than they bargained for. The exchange of threats concluded the confrontation, and Amy heard the sound of horses moving away from the cabin as the posse departed. But she remained frozen in her hiding place, afraid to move or make any sound that might alert any stragglers who might have remained behind. The darkness of the root cellar seemed less oppressive now that the immediate danger had passed, but she knew that her situation remained precarious. The sound of the cabin door closing told her that Zachary had returned inside, but still she waited. Minutes passed before she heard his voice calling softly down through the floorboards, and even then she hesitated before responding. They are gone, he said, his voice carrying relief and exhaustion in equal measure. You can come up now. But we need to talk about what happens next. Amy pushed aside the blanket and made her way carefully to the ladder, her legs shaky from the extended period of remaining motionless in the cramped space. The climb up to the cabin seemed to take forever, and when Zachary helped her through the trapdoor opening, she was surprised to see that the cabin looked exactly as it had before the search. He had already straightened the furniture and returned his belongings to their proper places. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the confrontation, and Zachary moved immediately to add fresh wood and restore the warmth that had been lost. Amy stood in the middle of the cabin, still hardly able to believe that she was alive and free, that the noose was no longer around her neck and the ropes no longer bound her hands. But she could see in Zachary's expression that their troubles were far from over. They will be back, he said without preamble, his voice grim as he poked at the fire. Judge Cook is not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully, and he suspects that you were here even though he could not prove it. We have bought ourselves some time, but not much. Amy sank into the chair by the fire, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the search began to fade. The warmth from the renewed flames felt like a blessing, but she could not shake the chill that had settled into her bones during those terrifying minutes in the root cellar. Why did you help me? She asked, looking at Zachary's face in the firelight. You do not know me. You do not know whether the accusations against me are true or false. You risked your life for a stranger, and I need to understand why. Zachary was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might provide the words he needed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-earned wisdom, the voice of a man who had learned difficult lessons about the nature of justice and mercy. Because I know what it feels like to be judged by people who do not understand you, he said. I know what it feels like to have your life torn apart by fear and prejudice. I know what it feels like to run from a justice that has nothing to do with truth and everything to do with the need to blame someone for things that cannot be explained. The words hung between them like a bridge across the gulf of their separate experiences, and Amy felt something shift inside her chest. a loosening of the tight knot of fear and desperation that had lived there for so long. Here was someone who understood, someone who had walked a similar path and survived to tell about it. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. "What brought you to these mountains?" Zachary's smile was bitter as winter wind, full of memories that still had the power to wound. "I was a doctor once, in a town not so different from Millbrook. I tried to help people, tried to use my knowledge to heal the sick and ease suffering. But when a fever took hold of the town, when children started dying despite everything I could do, they needed someone to blame. A doctor who could not save their children was worse than useless. He was a reminder of their own helplessness." Amy could see the pain in his eyes as he spoke, the weight of accusations that had driven him from his former life into this self-imposed exile. She understood now why he had been willing to risk everything to help her, why he had recognized in her situation an echo of his own tragedy. "They said I was in league with the devil," Zachary continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared the burden that he had carried alone for so long. "They said that I had caused the fever, that I was killing their children to feed my unholy appetites. The fact that I had dedicated my life to healing meant nothing when they needed a scapegoat for their grief and fear." The parallels between their stories were unmistakable, and Amy felt a deep sadness for the man who had given up everything he had worked for rather than face the mob justice that awaited him. But she also felt a growing sense of connection, a recognition that they were kindred spirits who had been shaped by similar experiences of persecution and exile. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "3 years," Zachary replied. 3 years of peace and solitude. 3 years of learning to live with myself and my choices. I thought I had found a place where the past could not reach me, but tonight proved that nowhere is truly safe from the kind of justice that Judge Cook represents." The admission carried a note of resignation that worried Amy more than any threat from the posse. She could see that Zachary was beginning to calculate the cost of helping her, beginning to realize that his sanctuary in the mountains might be lost forever because of his decision to cut the noose from her neck. "I am sorry," she said, her voice thick with guilt and regret. "I am sorry that my presence here has brought this trouble to your door. If I had known what it would cost you, I would have found another way." Zachary looked at her with surprise, as if her apology was the last thing he had expected to hear. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that had not been there before, a gentleness that reminded Amy of the man who had first found her collapsed against his cabin wall. "Do not apologize for seeking help when you needed it," he said. "Do not apologize for being the victim of other people's fear and hatred. I made my choice with full knowledge of the consequences, and I would make the same choice again if faced with the same situation." The declaration was delivered with such conviction that Amy felt tears spring to her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such kindness, such unwavering support in the face of danger, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a human being worthy of compassion. But practical concerns intruded on the moment of connection, and Amy forced herself to address the reality of their situation. "They will be back," she said, echoing Zachary's earlier words. "And when they come, they will be better prepared. They will not be satisfied with a simple search next time." Zachary nodded grimly, his expression showing that he had been thinking the same thing. Judge Cook is not the kind of man who gives up easily, especially when his authority has been challenged. He will return with more men, with better equipment, and he will not leave until he finds what he is looking for. The fire crackled and popped as they sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. Amy could see that Zachary was wrestling with difficult decisions, weighing the options available to them against the risks that each choice entailed. She wanted to help him think through their situation, but she also recognized that she was the cause of his dilemma and that her input might not be welcome. "We could run," Zachary said finally, his voice thoughtful as he explored the possibilities. "I know these mountains better than anyone, and there are places we could go where even Judge Cook would not be able to find us. But running means abandoning everything I have built here, everything that has given my life meaning for the past 3 years." Amy could hear the reluctance in his voice, the pain of a man contemplating the loss of the only home he had known since his exile began. She understood the weight of what he was considering, the magnitude of the sacrifice he would be making for someone he barely knew. "Or we could stay and fight," he continued, his voice growing harder. These mountains are my territory, and I know every trail, every hiding place, every advantage they offer. Judge Cook may have more men, but I have the high ground and the knowledge of the terrain. It would not be the first time that superior numbers have been defeated by superior tactics. The prospect of violence clearly troubled Zachary, and Amy could see the conflict playing out across his features. He was a healer by training and inclination, a man who had dedicated his life to preserving life rather than taking it. But he was also a man who had been pushed beyond his limits, who had found something worth fighting for in the person of a woman with a noose around her neck. There is a third option, Amy said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I could surrender myself to them. I could walk down that mountain and give myself up, tell them that you had nothing to do with my escape, that I forced my way into your cabin and hid without your knowledge. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Amy could see the immediate rejection of the idea in Zachary's eyes. But she pressed on, driven by the need to offer him a way out of the situation that her presence had created. They want me, not you, she said. If I give myself up, you can return to your life here. You can have your peace back, your sanctuary. Judge Cook will have his justice, and you will be free of the burden that I have brought to your door. Zachary's response was immediate and uncompromising, delivered with a force that surprised them both. No, he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. I will not let you sacrifice yourself for my comfort. I will not stand by and watch them murder an innocent woman while I do nothing to prevent it. The declaration was so fierce, so absolute in its conviction, that Amy felt her breath catch in her throat. She had expected him to at least consider her offer, to weigh the benefits of her surrender against the costs of continued resistance. But instead he had rejected it outright, had chosen to bind his fate to hers, despite the dangers that choice entailed. You do not know that I am innocent, she said, testing the strength of his conviction. You have only my word against the testimony of an entire town. How can you be so certain that you are protecting someone who deserves protection? Zachary turned to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to read the truth in people's hearts. I know because I have seen what guilt looks like, he said. I have seen how it changes a person, how it eats away at them from the inside until there is nothing left but hollow shame and desperate justification. You carry pain and fear and anger, but you do not carry guilt. Whatever they accused you of, you did not do it. The assessment was so accurate, so perfectly attuned to the emotional reality of her situation, that Amy felt tears begin to flow down her cheeks. For weeks, she had been surrounded by people who saw only what they expected to see, who looked at her and saw a witch, a murderer, a creature deserving of death. But Zachary looked at her and saw a human being, someone worthy of compassion and protection. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of emotions too long suppressed. Thank you for seeing me as I am rather than as they say I am. Zachary reached across the space between them and gently touched her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. The contact was brief but meaningful, a moment of human connection that bridged the gap between their separate experiences of persecution and exile. We will face this together, he said, his voice carrying the strength of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed from it. Whatever comes, whatever Judge Cook brings against us, we will meet it as allies. You are not alone anymore, Amy Myers. You have found sanctuary here, and I will defend that sanctuary with my life if necessary. The promise was given with such solemnity that Amy felt something fundamental shift inside her, a movement from despair toward hope that she had not thought possible only hours before. She was still in danger, still hunted by men who wanted to see her dead, but she was no longer alone. She had found someone who understood her situation, who shared her experience of being judged and found wanting by a society that feared what it could not understand. But even as hope began to bloom in her chest, practical concerns reasserted themselves. Judge Cook would return, probably with reinforcements, and when he did, both she and Zachary would face a reckoning that might cost them everything they had fought to preserve. The sanctuary that had seemed so secure only hours before now felt fragile and temporary, a brief respite before the storm that was surely coming. Outside the cabin, the mountain wind had picked up, howling through the pine trees with a voice that sounded like the wailing of lost souls. The sound reminded Amy of the legends her grandmother had told her about the spirits that dwelt in wild places, the ancient powers that watched over those who sought refuge in the wilderness. She wondered if those spirits were watching now, if they would offer their protection to two outcasts who had nowhere else to turn. The fire burned lower as the night wore on, but neither Amy nor Zachary made any move to retire. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead, each drawing strength from the presence of the other. The cabin felt like a fortress against the darkness, a small island of warmth and safety in a world that had shown them little of either. But both of them knew that morning would bring new dangers, new tests of their resolve and their alliance. Judge Cook would not be satisfied with a single failed search, and his next attempt would be more thorough, more determined, more dangerous than the first. The question was not whether he would return, but when, and whether they would be ready for him when he did. As the fire burned down to embers once again, Amy found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. The decisions that had led her from a quiet life as an herbalist to a desperate flight through the mountains with a noose around her neck. She thought about the friends who had betrayed her, the neighbors who had turned against her, the system of justice that had condemned her without truly examining the evidence against her. But she also thought about the unexpected kindness of Kevin Alvarez, who had looked her in the eye and chosen to protect her despite his earlier testimony against her. She thought about Samantha King, who had risked her own safety to help Amy escape from her cell. And most of all, she thought about Zachary Hall, who had taken a knife to the rope around her neck and told her she was free, who had offered her sanctuary in his mountain refuge despite the cost to himself. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep finally began to claim her, there was more good in the world than she had allowed herself to believe. Perhaps there were more people like Zachary and Kevin and Samantha than there were like Judge Cook and Brian Bennett and Tyler Cruz. Perhaps the darkness that had seemed to engulf her life was not as complete as she had feared. But even as hope whispered its gentle promises, Amy knew that the morning would bring a test of everything she had dared to believe about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Judge Cook would return, and when he did, she and Zachary would discover whether their alliance was strong enough to survive the storm that was coming for them both. The mountain wind continued to howl outside the cabin walls, carrying with it the promise of change and the threat of violence in equal measure. And in the dying light of the fire, two fugitives from different forms of injustice prepared to face whatever judgment the dawn might bring. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, creeping across the peaks like a reluctant witness to the violence that was surely coming. Amy woke to the sound of Zachary moving quietly around the cabin, his boots soft on the wooden floor as he prepared for what both of them knew would be their final confrontation with Judge Cook and his men. The fire had died to cold ashes during the night, but neither of them had slept deeply enough to tend it properly. Through the single window, Amy could see the gray light filtering through the pine trees, casting long shadows that seemed to point like accusing fingers toward the cabin. The mountain air carried the scent of snow, though the season was still weeks away from the first real storm. Everything felt poised on the edge of change, as if the very landscape was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Zachary had already dressed and armed himself, a rifle slung across his shoulder and a pistol at his hip. But Amy could see in his face that he took no pleasure in the prospect of violence. His hands, which had been so gentle when cutting the noose from her neck, now rested on weapons with the familiarity of a man who had learned to defend himself in this harsh wilderness. "They will come with the sun," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who understood his enemies. Judge Cook is not the kind of man who likes to work in darkness. He wants witnesses to his justice, even if those witnesses are only the mountains themselves. Amy rose from the chair where she had spent the night, her body stiff from sleeping in an upright position. The rope burns on her neck had scabbed over during the night, but they still throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. She moved to stand beside Zachary at the window, looking out at the trail that wound down through the pine trees toward the valley below. In the distance, she could see movement among the trees, dark shapes that resolved themselves into mounted men as they drew closer. Judge Cook had indeed returned, and he had brought reinforcements, just as Zachary had predicted. Amy counted at least a dozen riders, more than twice the number that had searched the cabin the night before. They moved with the deliberate purpose of men who had come to finish what they had started. How many? Zachary asked, though his eyes were already taking in the approaching force. Too many, Amy replied, her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. More than we can fight, certainly more than we can reason with. Zachary nodded grimly, his jaw set with the determination of a man who had made his peace with whatever fate awaited him. But Amy could see something else in his expression, a calculation that spoke of plans already forming in his mind. He had not survived 3 years alone in these mountains by accepting defeat easily, and she could sense that he was not ready to surrender now. There is still time for you to reconsider my offer, Amy said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that had kept her awake through the long hours of the night. I could walk out there and surrender myself. Tell them that you had nothing to do with my escape, that I forced my way into your cabin and hid without your knowledge. Zachary turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the gray morning light as he studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. When he spoke, his voice carried the same uncompromising conviction that had marked his refusal the night before, but now it was tempered with something deeper, something that made Amy heart race with emotions she was not ready to name. I told you last night that I would not let you sacrifice yourself for my comfort, he said. That decision has not changed with the dawn. We face this together, or we do not face it at all. The declaration was so absolute, so completely without reservation, that Amy felt tears spring to her eyes. She had spent so many years learning to rely only on herself, to expect nothing from others except disappointment and betrayal. But here was a man who had chosen to bind his fate to hers despite having known her for less than a day, who was willing to risk everything he had built for someone the world had already condemned. Why, she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of emotions too long suppressed. Why would you do this for me? Zachary reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that took her breath away. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the violence that was approaching their door, that Amy felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Because in all the years I have lived in these mountains, he said, his voice soft but carrying absolute conviction, I have never met anyone who reminded me so completely of why I chose to become a healer in the first place. You carry yourself with a dignity that no amount of persecution has been able to break. You face death with a courage that humbles me. And you have shown me that there are still people in this world worth fighting for. The words hit Amy like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her speechless with their unexpected power. She had thought of herself as broken, as damaged beyond repair by the accusations and persecution that had driven her to this desperate flight. But Zachary saw something else when he looked at her, something that she had almost forgotten existed. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and both of them turned to watch as Judge Cook and his enlarged posse approached the cabin. The judge rode at the head of the group, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of some predatory bird. His face was set in lines of grim determination, and Amy could see that he had not come to negotiate or to search. He had come to finish what he had started. Brian Bennett rode beside the judge, his massive frame making his horse look small beneath him. The man had always been quick to violence, and Amy could see the anticipation in his posture, the eagerness of someone who enjoyed the prospect of inflicting pain on others. Behind them came Tyler Cruz and the other members of the original posse, along with several new faces that Amy did not recognize. But it was the sight of Kevin Alvarez that surprised her most. The doctor rode near the back of the group, his face pale and drawn with what looked like genuine distress. Amy wondered what had compelled him to return after his act of mercy the night before, whether he had been forced to accompany the posse or whether he had come of his own accord. They are not here to search this time, Zachary observed, his voice carrying the tactical assessment of a man who understood the nature of the threat they faced. They are here to finish what they started, with or without evidence of your presence. Amy could see that he was right. The men had spread out as they approached, forming a loose circle around the cabin that would make escape impossible. They carried their weapons openly now, no longer pretending that this was a simple law enforcement operation. This was an execution party, and they had come prepared to kill anyone who stood in their way. Judge Cook's voice carried clearly across the clearing as he called out to the cabin, his words heavy with the authority of a man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. Zachary Hall, you will come out immediately with your hands visible. You are under arrest for harboring a fugitive and interfering with the administration of justice. Surrender now, and you may yet live to see another day. The ultimatum hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire, acrid with the promise of violence to come. Amy could see Zachary weighing his options, calculating the odds of survival against the certainty of what would happen if they surrendered. His face was calm, but she could sense the tension coiled in his muscles, the readiness of a man preparing for battle. "And what of Amy Myers?" Zachary called back, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "What justice do you offer her if I surrender?" Judge Cook's response was immediate and uncompromising, delivered with the finality of a man who had already passed judgment. "Amy Myers is a convicted witch who escaped lawful execution. She will hang as sentence was passed, and any man who aided her escape will hang beside her. That is the only justice available in this matter." The words confirmed what both Amy and Zachary had already known, but hearing them spoken aloud still sent a chill through Amy's bones. There would be no mercy, no consideration of evidence or extenuating circumstances. Judge Cook had come to kill them both, and he would not be satisfied with anything less than their deaths. Zachary turned away from the window and began moving around the cabin with swift, efficient movements. Amy watched as he checked his weapons, secured loose items that might become projectiles if the cabin came under fire, and positioned himself near the window where he would have the best field of fire when the shooting started. "What can I do?" Amy asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. "I will not cower in the corner while you fight for both our lives." Zachary paused in his preparations and looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "There is a rifle in the corner," he said. "Do you know how to use it?" Amy nodded, thinking of the lessons her father had given her as a child, teaching her to hunt small game in the woods around their farm. She had not held a weapon in years, but the skills came back to her as she lifted the rifle and checked its load. The weight of it in her hands was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that she was no longer a helpless victim, but an active participant in whatever was about to unfold. "The cabin has good thick walls," Zachary said as he took position at the window. "They will have to come close to have any real chance of hitting us, and that gives us the advantage. These mountains have taught me patience, and patience is often the difference between life and death in situations like this." Outside, Judge Cook was growing impatient with the lack of response from the cabin. His voice carried a note of rising anger as he called out again, his words heavy with threat and promise. "You have 1 minute to surrender, Hall. After that, we will assume you are resisting arrest and we will act accordingly. There will be no further warnings, no further opportunities for mercy." Amy could see movement among the trees as the posse members took positions around the cabin, using the pine trunks for cover as they prepared for what was clearly going to be a siege. Some of them carried rifles, others pistols, and she could see at least one man with what looked like a shotgun. They were well armed and determined, but they were also exposed on unfamiliar ground. Zachary seemed to read her thoughts as he watched the men positioning themselves. "They think their numbers give them the advantage," he said quietly. "But numbers mean little when you are fighting on ground you do not know against someone who has made it his home. These mountains will help us if we are smart about how we use them." The minute that Judge Cook had given them passed with agonizing slowness, marked by the sound of men moving through the underbrush and the nervous whickering of horses that sensed the tension in the air. Amy found herself holding her breath as the deadline approached, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her rifle as she waited for the violence to begin. When it came suddenly and without further warning. The first shot shattered the morning silence like thunder, the bullet splintering the wood of the cabin wall inches from where Amy crouched. She flinched instinctively but held her position, her heart racing as the reality of combat crashed over her like a wave. More shots followed in rapid succession, the sound of gunfire echoing off the mountain walls and creating a cacophony that seemed to come from all directions at once. Zachary returned fire immediately, his rifle speaking with the authority of a man who knew how to use it. Amy heard a cry of pain from somewhere among the trees, evidence that his shot had found its mark. But the return fire was immediate and intense, forcing both of them to keep their heads down as bullets shattered the cabin windows and punched holes in the wooden walls. "Stay low," Zachary called to her over the noise of gunfire. "They are trying to panic us into making mistakes. Let them waste their ammunition while we pick our shots carefully." Amy nodded and forced herself to breathe deeply, fighting against the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational thought. She had never been in a gunfight before, had never experienced the chaos and confusion of combat, but she could see that Zachary was right about the need for patience and precision. Their ammunition was limited, and every shot had to count if they were going to survive. A figure moved between the trees, and Amy caught a glimpse of Brian Bennett's massive frame as he tried to work his way closer to the cabin. She raised her rifle and took careful aim, remembering her father lessons about breathing and trigger control. The shot was difficult, partially obscured by branches and pine needles, but she squeezed the trigger smoothly and watched as Bennett stumbled and fell behind a fallen log. "Good shot," Zachary said, his voice carrying approval and something that might have been pride. "You have steady hands under pressure." The compliment warmed Amy more than it should have, given their desperate circumstances. But there was something about earning Zachary respect that made her feel stronger, more capable of facing whatever came next. She had spent so long being seen as a victim, as someone who needed protection and rescue, that the opportunity to fight alongside him as an equal was both terrifying and exhilarating. The gunfire continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sound rolling across the mountain landscape like distant thunder. Amy could hear Judge Cook shouting orders to his men, directing them to concentrate their fire on specific points of the cabin. But the thick log walls that Zachary had built were holding against the assault, and their elevated position gave them a clear view of anyone trying to approach. Tyler Cruz made the mistake of breaking cover too early, exposing himself as he tried to reach a better firing position. Amy and Zachary fired almost simultaneously, their bullets catching him in the chest and spinning him around before he collapsed in the pine needles. The sight of his death should have horrified Amy, but instead she felt only a grim satisfaction. These men had come to kill her, and she would not apologize for defending herself. But their success was drawing attention, and Amy could see that Judge Cook was repositioning his men for a more coordinated assault. The initial chaos of the gunfight was giving way to a more systematic approach, with some men providing covering fire, while others moved to better positions. It was clear that the judge had some military experience, and he was using it to maximum advantage. "They are learning," Zachary observed, his voice tight with concentration as he reloaded his rifle. "The next assault will be better coordinated, more dangerous. We need to be ready for it." As if summoned by his words, a new volley of gunfire erupted from the trees, more intense and focused than anything they had faced before. The bullets came from multiple directions, forcing Amy and Zachary to move constantly to avoid being pinned down in any one position. The cabin walls, which had seemed so solid and protective, now felt thin and vulnerable under the sustained assault. A bullet passed so close to Amy's head that she could feel the wind of its passage, and she threw herself to the floor as splinters of wood rained down around her. The fear that she had been holding at bay finally broke through her defenses, and for a moment she was paralyzed by the certainty that she was about to die in this remote cabin, far from anyone who would mourn her passing. But then she felt Zachary, hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring despite the chaos around them. His touch reminded her that she was not alone, that someone was fighting beside her who cared whether she lived or died. The knowledge gave her strength to push past her fear and return to the fight. "We need to break their rhythm," Zachary said, his voice calm despite the bullets that continued to punch holes in the cabin walls. "They think they have us pinned down, but we still have options they have not considered." Amy looked at him questioningly, wondering what options could possibly remain when they were outnumbered and surrounded. But she could see in his eyes that he was not ready to surrender, that his mind was still working on solutions, even as their situation grew more desperate by the minute. "There is a back way out of this cabin," he said, his voice low but urgent. "A tunnel I dug that leads to the root cellar and then out to the stream behind the cabin. If we can reach it without being seen, we can get behind them and turn this siege into a running battle." The prospect of leaving the relative safety of the cabin was terrifying, but Amy could see the wisdom in Zachary's plan. They could not hold their position indefinitely, and eventually Judge Cook men would find a way to overwhelm their defenses. Better to take the initiative while they still had the strength and ammunition to fight effectively. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that continued to gnaw at her insides. "Cover me while I open the tunnel entrance," Zachary replied. "Then follow me as quickly as you can. Once we are outside, stay close and do exactly what I tell you. These mountains can be our allies, but only if we use them correctly." Amy nodded and took position at the window, her rifle ready as Zachary moved to the back corner of the cabin. She could hear him working behind her, the sound of wood being moved and stone being shifted, but she forced herself to concentrate on the trees where Judge Cook men were positioned. Any one of them might try to rush the cabin while they thought the defenders were distracted. A figure moved among the pines, and Amy fired instinctively, her bullet clipping branches and sending the man diving for cover. The return fire was immediate and intense, but it also revealed the positions of several shooters that she had not been able to locate before. She made mental notes of their locations, information that might prove valuable once they were outside and moving. "Ready," Zachary called softly from behind her. "The tunnel is open. We go now while they are focused on the front of the cabin." Amy took one last look at the clearing where Judge Cook men were positioned, then turned and followed Zachary toward the back of the cabin. The tunnel entrance was concealed behind a heavy wooden cabinet that he had moved aside, revealing a narrow opening that led down into darkness. The space looked barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and Amy felt a moment of claustrophobia as she contemplated entering it. But there was no time for hesitation. The gunfire outside was intensifying, and she could hear Judge Cook shouting orders that suggested a final assault was being prepared. Whatever chance they had of escaping depended on moving immediately before their enemies realized what was happening. Zachary went first, his large frame disappearing into the narrow tunnel with surprising ease. Amy followed, the rifle clutched tightly in her hands as she crawled through the confined space. The tunnel was longer than she had expected, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint light that filtered down from the cabin above. The air in the tunnel was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and stone that reminded Amy of graves and burial chambers. She tried not to think about the weight of soil and rock above her head, tried not to imagine what would happen if the tunnel collapsed while they were inside it. Instead, she focused on the sound of Zachary breathing ahead of her, the reassuring presence that reminded her she was not alone in the darkness. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through the earth like the burrow of some enormous animal. Amy could hear the muffled sound of gunfire above them, the voices of men who were still focused on the cabin they had just abandoned. But she could also hear something else, a sound that made her heart race with hope, running water growing louder as they moved deeper into the tunnel. Light appeared ahead of them, faint but growing stronger, and soon Amy could see Zachary's silhouette against what looked like a natural cave opening. The sound of water was much louder now, and she could smell the fresh scent of a mountain stream. They were almost free of the tunnel, almost back in the open air where they could breathe and move and fight on more equal terms. Zachary emerged from the tunnel first, his rifle ready as he scanned the area for any sign of Judge Cook men. Amy followed, blinking in the sudden brightness as her eyes adjusted to the daylight. They were standing beside the stream she had heard during her first desperate flight through the mountains, the same water that had led her to Zachary cabin and sanctuary. The stream provided natural cover, its banks lined with rocks and fallen trees that would conceal their movement from anyone watching from the cabin area. But Amy could see that their escape had not gone unnoticed. Shouts were coming from the direction of the cabin, voices raised in alarm as Judge Cookman realized that their quarry had vanished. "They know we are gone," Zachary said quietly, his eyes scanning the terrain as he planned their next move. "But they do not know where we went or which direction we are heading. That gives us a small advantage, but we need to use it quickly." Amy nodded, her heart still racing from the claustrophobic journey through the tunnel. But she felt stronger now that they were back in the open air, more capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. The rifle in her hands felt like an extension of her will, a tool that could help her shape her own destiny rather than simply accepting whatever fate others chose to impose on her. "Which way?" she asked, looking at the stream that flowed down from the high peaks above them. "Up," Zachary replied without hesitation. higher into the mountains, where the terrain gets rougher and the air gets thinner. Judge Cook men are not prepared for high-altitude fighting, and the cold will work in our favor as the day wears on. They began moving immediately, following the stream upward through terrain that grew more rugged with each step. The water provided a natural path through the wilderness, but it also meant that they were moving over rocks and loose stones that could turn an ankle or send them tumbling into the rushing current. Amy found herself grateful for the years she had spent walking through the forests around Millbrook, gathering herbs and learning to move quietly through difficult terrain. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing louder. Judge Cook had organized his men quickly, and they were following the stream just as Amy and Zachary were. But the Judge men were on horseback, which meant they could move faster on level ground, but would be at a disadvantage once the terrain became too steep for their mounts. "We need to reach the high country before they catch up to us," Zachary said, his breathing slightly labored as they climbed higher into the mountains. "Once we get above the tree line, their horses will be useless, and we will have the advantage of knowing the terrain." Amy could hear the logic in his plan, but she could also feel her own strength beginning to ebb as the altitude and exertion took their toll. She had been running on adrenaline and determination since her escape from the cabin, but now the reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were being hunted by armed men through wilderness that could kill them as easily as any bullet. But she also felt something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. She felt alive in a way that she had not experienced in years, fully present and engaged with the world around her in a way that her quiet life as an herbalist had never demanded. The danger was real and immediate, but so was the sense of purpose that came from fighting for her own survival alongside someone who had chosen to share that fight. A gunshot echoed off the mountain walls, the bullet striking the rocks near Amy's feet and sending chips of stone flying in all directions. She looked back and saw Judge Cook men emerging from the tree line below them, their horses lathered with sweat from the hard climb. Brian Bennett was among them, his massive frame unmistakable, even at a distance, and Amy could see the rage in his posture as he raised his rifle for another shot. "Keep moving," Zachary called to her, his own rifle speaking as he returned fire. "Do not give them a stationary target to aim at." Amy forced her legs to carry her higher up the rocky slope, her lungs burning as the thin air made each breath a struggle. The stream beside them had narrowed to a rushing torrent, white with foam as it cascaded down from the peaks above. The sound of the water was almost loud enough to drown out the gunfire behind them, but not quite loud enough to mask the sound of pursuit. More shots rang out, the bullets whining off the rocks around them as Judge Cook men tried to find their range. But the distance was considerable, and shooting uphill at moving targets was difficult even for experienced marksmen. Amy and Zachary had the advantage of terrain and position, but they also had the disadvantage of being outnumbered and outgunned. The slope began to level out as they reached a natural shelf in the mountainside, a flat area that provided temporary respite from the grueling climb. Amy collapsed against a boulder, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath in the thin air. Zachary took position behind another rock, his rifle ready as he watched their pursuers struggling up the slope below. "This is as good a place as any to make a stand," he said, his voice calm despite their desperate circumstances. "The terrain funnels them into a narrow approach, and we have good cover and a clear field of fire. If we are going to fight them, this is where we do it." Amy looked around the natural amphitheater where they had taken shelter, seeing it with new eyes as she considered its tactical advantages. Zachary was right about the terrain. Their pursuers would have to approach through a narrow defile between two rock walls, exposing themselves to defensive fire from above. It was not an ideal position for an assault, which meant Judge Cook would have to decide whether to press the attack or try to find another route. But Amy could also see the disadvantages of their position. They were trapped on the shelf with no easy route of escape, and their ammunition was limited. If Judge Cook chose to simply surround them and wait, time would eventually work in his favor. The cold mountain air was already beginning to sap their strength, and they had no food or water beyond what they carried. "How many shots do you have left?" she asked Zachary, checking her own rifle to confirm what she already knew. "Not enough," he replied grimly. "Maybe a dozen rounds between us, and that assumes every shot finds its mark. Against 12 men, those are not good odds." Amy nodded, understanding the mathematics of their situation, even as she refused to accept defeat. They had come too far and fought too hard to surrender now, regardless of the odds they faced. If this was where their story ended, she would make sure it was an ending worthy of the struggle they had endured. The sound of approaching voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and soon Amy could see Judge Cook men working their way up the narrow defile toward their position. The judge himself was in the lead, his black coat making him an obvious target against the gray stone of the mountain. Behind him came Brian Bennett and the others, their weapons ready as they prepared for the final confrontation. "Zachary Hall," Judge Cook called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls around them. "You have led us a fine chase, but it ends here. Surrender now, and I give you my word that your death will be quick and clean. Continue to resist, and I cannot guarantee such mercy." The offer was delivered with the authority of a man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness, but Amy could hear the underlying uncertainty in Judge Cook's voice. The climb had been harder than he had expected, and his men were tired and exposed. He wanted this confrontation to end as much as they did, but he was not willing to admit defeat. "Your word has proven to be worth very little, Judge Cook," Zachary called back, his voice carrying clearly across the rocky amphitheater. "You promised justice, but all you have delivered is persecution and murder. I think we will take our chances with the mountains rather than trust in your mercy." The exchange of words was really an exchange of time, each side trying to gain some small advantage before the shooting started again. Amy could see Judge Cook men spreading out as much as the narrow terrain would allow, trying to present multiple targets and reduce the effectiveness of defensive fire. But they were still constrained by the geography, still forced to approach through the killing ground that Zachary had chosen. "Very well," Judge Cook said, his voice heavy with finality. "You have chosen your fate, and I will not waste any more words trying to change your mind. Men, you know your duty. Take them alive if possible, but take them." The final battle began with a thunderous volley of gunfire that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Amy pressed herself against the boulder that provided her cover, feeling the impacts of bullets against the stone as Judge Cook men poured fire into their position. The sound was deafening, echoing off the rock walls and creating a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But Zachary had chosen their position well, and the natural fortifications of the mountain shell protected them from the worst of the assault. Amy could hear bullets whining overhead and striking the rocks around them, but none found their mark. When the initial volley ended, she raised her rifle and began picking her targets carefully, each shot aimed with the precision that her father had taught her years before. Her first bullet caught one of Judge Cook's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back down the rocky slope. The second found Brian Bennett in the chest, the massive man staggering backward with a look of surprise on his face before he collapsed among the stones. Amy felt no satisfaction in the killing, but she felt no regret either. These men had come to murder her, and she would not apologize for defending her life. Zachary's rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastating in its effect. Amy watched as he systematically reduced the number of their attackers, his years of living in the mountains having taught him patience and accuracy that served them well in this desperate situation. But she could also see that their ammunition was running dangerously low, and Judge Cook still had men in reserve. The judge himself had taken cover behind a fallen tree, directing his remaining men with the tactical skill of someone who had seen combat before. Amy could see him calculating the odds, weighing the cost of continuing the assault against the certainty of eventual victory. His men were dying, but so was their ammunition, and time was on his side. A new voice joined the battle, calling out from somewhere below their position. It was Kevin Alvarez, and his words carried clearly over the sound of gunfire. "Judge Cook, this has gone far enough. Too many men have died already. And for what? To satisfy your wounded pride. To prove that your authority cannot be questioned. This is not justice, it is butchery." The doctor words seemed to have an effect on the remaining men, several of whom had stopped firing and were looking uncertainly at their leader. Amy could see doubt creeping into their faces, the recognition that they were participating in something that had moved far beyond the boundaries of law and justice into the realm of personal vendetta. But Judge Cook's response was immediate and uncompromising, delivered with the authority of a man who would not tolerate dissent in his ranks. "Dr. Alvarez, you will keep your opinions to yourself, or you will join the fugitives in their fate. These people are criminals who have resisted lawful arrest and killed officers of the law. They will face justice, regardless of the cost. The threat was clear and unmistakable, but Amy could see that it had not silenced the growing murmur of discontent among Judge Cook's remaining men. The doctor words had planted seeds of doubt that were beginning to flower into open rebellion against the judge authority. Kevin Alvarez stepped into view, his hands raised but his voice strong as he continued to challenge his leader. Look around you, Judge Cook. Look at what your justice has accomplished. Good men are dead, and for what? To hang a woman whose only crime was living differently than you think she should. To kill a man whose only offense was showing mercy to someone in need. This is not the law, it is madness. The doctor words seemed to break something in the remaining men, and Amy watched as several of them lowered their weapons and stepped back from the fight. The moral authority that Judge Cook had wielded so effectively in Millbrook was crumbling here in the mountains, where his righteousness seemed small and petty against the vast indifference of the peaks. But the judge himself was not ready to surrender, and his response was swift and violent. His pistol appeared in his hand as if by magic, and the shot that followed echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. Kevin Alvarez staggered backward, his hands pressed to his chest where blood was beginning to seep through his fingers. The sight of their leader shooting one of his own men was too much for the remaining members of the posse. Amy watched as they threw down their weapons and began backing away from the confrontation, their faces pale with shock and revulsion. Judge Cook had finally pushed too far, had finally revealed the true nature of the man beneath the robes of authority. But the judge himself seemed oblivious to the desertion of his men, his attention focused entirely on Amy and Zachary as they crouched behind their rocky fortifications. His face was twisted with rage and something that might have been madness, the expression of a man who had invested so much of himself in this pursuit that he could not accept failure. "You think you have won," he called out, his voice cracking with strain and exhaustion. "You think that turning my own men against me changes anything? But I am the law here, and the law will not be denied. If I have to kill you myself with my own hands, then so be it." Amy could see that Judge Cook had moved beyond reason, beyond any possibility of negotiation or surrender. He was no longer fighting for justice or law or even personal authority. He was fighting for something deeper and more primal, some fundamental need to impose his will on a world that had dared to resist him. Zachary seemed to understand this as well, and his voice carried a note of finality as he called out to their remaining enemy. "Then come and finish it, Judge Cook. Stop hiding behind your men and your authority and face us yourself. If you truly believe in the righteousness of your cause, prove it with your own blood rather than the blood of others." The challenge hung in the mountain air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Amy could see its effect on Judge Cook's face. The man had built his entire identity around the concept of moral authority, and to have that authority challenged so directly was more than he could bear. His response was immediate and predictable. Judge Cook emerged from his cover with his pistol raised, his black coat billowing behind him as he charged up the rocky slope toward their position. His face was a mask of rage and determination, and Amy could see that he had moved beyond any concern for his own safety. This was no longer about law or justice or even survival. This was about proving that his will could not be broken, regardless of the cost. Zachary and Amy fired simultaneously, their rifles speaking with the final authority of lead and powder. Judge Cook stumbled but did not fall, his own pistol barking as he returned fire. Amy felt something burn across her shoulder, a line of fire that told her she had been hit, but the wound was not serious enough to stop her from working the bolt of her rifle and firing again. The second volley found its mark with devastating effect. Judge Cook jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist, his pistol flying from his hand to clatter among the rocks. For a moment he stood swaying on the slope, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been understanding. Then he toppled backward and lay still, his black coat spread around him like the wings of a fallen angel. The sudden silence that followed was almost deafening after the chaos of battle. Amy could hear her own breathing. Her breathing, harsh and labored in the thin mountain air, and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees far below them. But there were no more gunshots, no more shouts of command or cries of pain. The confrontation that had begun with her desperate flight through the mountains had finally reached its end. Zachary moved cautiously toward Judge Cook's fallen form, his rifle ready in case the man was still alive and dangerous. But Amy could see from the stillness of the body and the spreading pool of blood beneath it that their enemy was beyond any further threat. The judge who had been so certain of his righteousness, so convinced of his authority, had found the limits of both in the rocks and stones of the high country. Kevin Alvarez was still alive, though barely. Amy could see him struggling to sit up against a boulder, his hands pressed to the wound in his chest. Without thinking, she left her defensive position and made her way down the slope toward him, her healer instincts overriding any concerns about her own safety. The doctor looked up as she approached, his face pale, but his eyes still alert. When he spoke, his voice was weak but carried a note of satisfaction that surprised Amy with its intensity. "I am glad you made it," he said, each word an effort that cost him precious strength. "I am glad that someone finally stood up to him, finally showed him that his authority had limits." Amy knelt beside him and examined the wound, her trained eyes taking in the damage that Judge Cook's bullet had inflicted. It was serious, possibly fatal, but not immediately so. With proper care and rest, the doctor might survive his injury, though he would need help to reach safety. "Why did you help me?" she asked as she worked to stop the bleeding. "At my trial, you testified against me. You said my remedies were the devil work. What changed your mind?" Kevin Alvarez managed a weak smile, his eyes focusing on her face with an effort that spoke of his failing strength. "I never believed you were a witch," he said quietly, "but I was afraid of what would happen to me if I spoke against the popular opinion. It was easier to go along with the crowd than to stand up for what I knew was right. When I saw you in that root cellar, saw the fear in your eyes and the noose marks on your neck, I realized that my cowardice had nearly cost an innocent woman her life." The admission was delivered with the weight of a confession, and Amy could see the pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with his physical wound. This was a man who had been forced to confront his own moral failures, who had found the courage to act rightly only when it was almost too late. "You saved my life," Amy said simply. "Whatever you did before, whatever mistakes you made, you redeemed them when it mattered most." The doctor nodded weakly, his breathing becoming more labored as the shock of his wound began to take its toll. But there was peace in his expression, the look of a man who had finally found the courage to act according to his conscience rather than his fears. Zachary appeared beside them, his own wounds minor compared to what Kevin Alvarez had suffered. He looked down at the doctor with something that might have been respect, recognizing in him a kindred spirit who had chosen to do the right thing despite the personal cost. "We need to get him to safety," Zachary said quietly. "He will not survive long in these mountains without proper medical attention." Amy nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation, but also recognizing the practical difficulties they faced. They were miles from any settlement, high in the mountains where the air was thin and the cold was beginning to bite. Moving an injured man through such terrain would be dangerous for all of them, but leaving him behind was not an option. "The other men," Amy asked, looking around at the scattered weapons and abandoned positions where Judge Cook's posse had made their stand. "What happened to them?" "They ran," Zachary replied with something that might have been satisfaction. "When they saw their leader shoot one of his own men, it broke whatever hold he had over them. They wanted no part of his madness, and they made that clear by walking away from the fight." Amy felt a surge of relief at the news. She had no desire to see more men die, even men who had come to kill her. The fact that they had chosen to abandon Judge Cook rather than continue the slaughter suggested that there was still some decency left in the world, some recognition that authority had limits and that some orders should not be obeyed. But their immediate situation remained precarious. They were alone in the high mountains with an injured man. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and winter was coming with the inevitability of death itself. They had won the battle, but the war for survival was far from over. "We need to move," Zachary said, his voice carrying the urgency of their situation. "The weather is changing, and we cannot afford to be caught in the open when the snow starts to fall." Amy looked up at the sky, seeing for the first time the dark clouds that were gathering around the peaks above them. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of snow and the promise of a storm that could trap them in the mountains until spring. They had escaped Judge Cook's justice, but they still faced the judgment of the wilderness itself. Working together, they managed to get Kevin Alvarez to his feet and began the careful descent toward lower ground. The doctor was weak but conscious, able to walk with assistance, though every step was clearly an effort that cost him dearly. Amy found herself admiring his courage, the determination that kept him moving despite his pain, and the knowledge that he might not survive the journey ahead. The path down the mountain was treacherous, made more dangerous by their need to support an injured man and the gathering darkness of the approaching storm. Amy could feel the temperature dropping with each step, and she knew that they would need shelter soon or risk freezing to death in the wilderness they had fought so hard to reach. But as they descended toward the tree line, Amy felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope, real tangible hope for a future that extended beyond the next few hours or days. She had faced the worst that Judge Cook and his brand of justice could offer, and she had not only survived, but triumphed. The woman who had arrived at Zachary cabin with a noose around her neck was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more certain of her own worth. Zachary walked beside her, his presence a constant source of strength and reassurance. He had risked everything to help her, had stood with her against impossible odds, and had proven that there were still people in the world willing to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The bond between them had been forged in violence and tested in blood, but it had emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. As the first snowflakes began to fall around them, Amy Myers looked ahead toward whatever future awaited them in the wilderness. She did not know what challenges lay ahead, what hardships they would face, or what joys they might discover. But she knew that she would face them as a free woman, unchained from the fears and prejudices that had once defined her life. The noose that had once hung around her neck was gone, cut away by the kindness of a stranger who had become something more. In its place was the possibility of a new life, a fresh start in a world that suddenly seemed full of promise rather than threat. Amy Myers had found her freedom in the mountains, and she would never let anyone take it away from her again. The snow fell heavier now, covering the rocks and trees with a blanket of white that seemed to wash away the blood and violence of the day. Somewhere behind them, Judge Stephen Cook lay dead among the stones, his authority finally and permanently broken. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, but also hope, and the promise of a tomorrow that they would face together. In the end, Amy thought as they made their way down the mountain through the gathering storm, that was all anyone could ask for. The chance to choose their own path, to write their own story, to live and die according to their own conscience rather than the dictates of others. She had paid a terrible price for that freedom, but as she walked through the snow beside the man who had helped her claim it, she knew that it had been worth every moment of fear and pain and struggle. The mountains stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and unforgiving, but no longer hostile. They had found their place in the wilderness, their sanctuary from a world that had tried to destroy them. And in finding that place, they had found something even more precious. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves.